The movie opens with the Chicago Emergency Services arriving on the scene of a brutal murder of a woman, Helen Kimble. Her husband, Richard Kimble, a surgeon, is still in shock but is taken into custody by the police, as the news reporters note the sketchy 911 call that came from the residence. Just a few days before, Richard and his wife were attending a function together, with no signs of anything going wrong. He now currently sits in the interrogation room, recalling his last moments with his wife as they returned from the function. He got a call at that time to show up at the hospital to help with a surgery. The cops ask him about anything strange happening at his home, like phone calls or strangers, but Richard can't recall anything. They ask him to expound on his fight with the one-armed intruder, whom Richard recalls had a fake arm. They ask about the scratches on his neck, which he got when he tried to move Helen, and his gun, which was found on the scene. From the angle of questioning, the cops don't believe Richard's story one bit. Outside the room, other cops get the forensics report that shows only Richard's DNA all over the scene. They also find out that Richard is the sole beneficiary of Helen's life insurance, and Richard now realizes the position he is in. Richard cannot believe the cops' line of questioning and is adamant that there was a man with a fake arm that killed Helen and demands that the cops find him. The cops are not convinced and charge Richard with the crime. At the trial, the prosecutor insists that Richard attacked and killed Helen. The responding officer notes that there was no sign of a break-in, and the investigation showed Richard's prints on the gun and bullets. The prosecution then plays Helen's 911 call, where they hear her say, "Richard, he's trying to kill me," and take that as proof that Helen was naming her attacker. Based on all this evidence, Richard is sentenced to death by lethal injection and is to be remanded in state penitentiary until his death. Kimble is rounded up with other prisoners and loaded onto a transport bus headed to the prison. The bus heads out on a normal routine transport, which leads into nightfall. 40 minutes away from its location, Richard realizes the prisoners are up to something. One man begins to fake a seizure, foaming at the mouth. One guard comes to check and gets shanked. The others struggle with another cop with a gun who ends up shooting the driver, causing the bus to crash and roll over a ravine. Richard and a guard survive the crash, and Richard has the guard unlock him so he can help another injured guard. Just then, they realize the bus is sitting on train tracks, and everybody bails from the bus, leaving Richard. Richard struggles with the injured guard, barely managing to escape the wreckage before the train slams into it in a fiery mess. Richard dives into a ditch to escape the derailing train, which destroys everything around. Richard crawls to safety, where he is helped by another escaped prisoner, Copeland, who then decides to go his own way. Richard realizes he is injured but, seeing a chance to prove his innocence, takes off into the night. 90 minutes later, Deputy Marshal Samuel Gerard and his team arrive on the scene. He goes to meet Sheriff Rollins, who is talking to the guard, who claims that he saved his colleague on his own and that Richard is probably dead, hiding the fact he freed him. Samuel wants to set up roadblocks and checkpoints to catch the escapees, but Rollins thinks it's a waste of time since all the prisoners are dead. Samuel wastes no time in taking over the investigation, and a hurt Rollins tells all his men to stand down. One of Samuel's men then finds open leg chains and forces the guard to confess that Richard had escaped. Samuel immediately launches a manhunt for Richard, calculating how far he could have run in 90 minutes and ordering his men to hunt him down. By morning, Richard is still making his way and manages to steal an overall and get changed. Samuel's team has found a blood trail, and realizing Richard may be injured, he has cops stationed at every hospital in the area. There is a commotion as the men have located the guard that Richard has saved. Richard manages to sneak into a nearby hospital and breaks into a treatment room to get himself patched up. He then shaves his face clean and gets a change of clothes. As he exits the room, he runs into a cop who does not recognize him even after looking him in the face. Outside, he sees the injured guard arrive at the hospital. He briefly recognizes Richard but is taken away quickly, and Richard steals the ambulance and leaves. Samuel and his team soon get news of this. They get the location of the ambulance and hurry off in a helicopter to intercept it. They catch up with the speeding ambulance quickly, and Richard hits the gas. He enters a tunnel, but the chopper is blocking his exit. Richard is forced to stop and jump from the ambulance, and the cops have blocked him in. Samuel and his men close in with their weapons drawn, but Richard quickly dips away into the darkness, using the traffic as cover to escape the ambush. The cops are left puzzled until they realize that Richard has escaped into the sewers. Samuel takes 2 of his guys and goes after him. Meanwhile, Richard tries to divert his pursuers by leaving his jacket on a false path. Samuel pulls up to the spot. He sends his 2 guys to follow the fake path and decides to follow his instincts. He hears the sounds of Richard climbing through the sewers and chases after him, but ends up falling and losing his gun. Richard picks up his gun and holds him at gunpoint, telling him he didn't kill his wife, but Samuel doesn't care. Richard runs away, and Samuel pulls another gun and gives chase. He corners Richard at the mouth of the sewers, which leads into a massive dam, and holds him at gunpoint, demanding he surrender. But Richard is determined to prove his innocence and jumps from the great height, landing in the water. Samuel is more impressed than upset with Richard's resolve to escape. He doesn't think Richard is dead and orders his men to scan the entire river for him. Richard, though shaken up, manages to survive without any major injuries. He is trying to make his escape, but his old injury reopens, and he collapses. That night as he lays there, he has flashbacks to his moments with Helen, her death, and the fight he had with the intruder before jumping awake the next morning. Richard dyes his hair before hitting the road when he is offered a ride by a woman. Samuel and his team return to their offices, where they get news about Copeland's location. Samuel and his team pull up to the location under disguise and burst into the apartment building, guns drawn. Copeland grabs one of Samuel's men and holds him at gunpoint, but Samuel manages to shoot Copeland, killing him. Richard makes his way to the city and contacts his lawyer Walter, wanting money and a place to stay, but the lawyer wants him to surrender, so Richard hangs up. Samuel gets the recording of Richard and Walter's conversation as they have been tapping the lawyer's phone. After analyzing the background noises and sounds in the recording, Samuel and his team are shocked to realize that Richard is back in the city and mobilized to track him down. Richard tracks down his colleague Charlie, who gives him money without question. He wants to help, but Richard doesn't want to get him in any trouble and walks away. Samuel and his team are trying to deduce why Richard would kill Helen and decide to go over his entire file once more. Richard rents a small rundown apartment. He then sneaks into the Cook County Hospital and heads to the prosthetics department to look around. Realizing he needs to investigate further, Richard comes up with a plan and heads to the basement, where he steals a janitor ID. Samuel goes to interview Charlie, who confesses that he saw Richard and gave him money. They want Charlie's help to bring in Richard, but Charlie refuses to help them as he thinks Richard is innocent and they will never find him. While Richard begins to immerse himself in studying prosthetics, Samuel interviews the rest of his colleagues, who all think Richard is innocent and would help him if he needed it. Richard again recalls his fight with the intruder where he broke his prosthetic arm at the joint. He wakes up to the cops surrounding his apartment building. Richard begins to freak out as he is trapped but is relieved to see the cops have come for his landlady's elder son for dealing drugs. One night, Richard enters the prosthetics department disguised as a janitor. Once he is alone in a room, he gains access to the computers and begins to gather info on all prosthetic patients who would need a joint replacement, narrowing down the results to 5 suspects. The landlady's son snitches to the cops that Richard is the one staying in his basement all for a burger. That night at the hospital, there is a major accident involving multiple people, and Richard is barely holding himself back from helping. A doctor asks him to move a patient and sees him analyzing the patient's X-ray. Samuel and his team enter Richard's apartment and see where he created a fake ID for the hospital. Richard is moving the patient. He goes over the boy's file and makes corrections to his diagnosis based on his observations and moves the boy to surgery, saving his life. The doctor from earlier spots Richard and confronts him, wanting to know who he really is and why the patient was moved to surgery. She threatens to call security, forcing Richard to flee the hospital. Samuel interviews the doctor afterward and learns that Richard actually saved the boy. He wonders why Richard would return to a hospital where he is being hunted until he sees the prosthetics department and realizes that Richard is trying to solve his wife's case. They also begin to look into the prosthetic patients, and Samuel wants criminal records on all of them. Richard also begins to narrow down his suspects and heads over to City Hall to speak with a suspect, but when he sees the man, he realizes he is not the suspect. As Richard is leaving the courthouse, Samuel, who had arrived a bit earlier, spots him and calls out his name. Richard takes off running with Samuel hot on his tail. He races to the lobby, and Samuel spots him and orders the gates closed, but Richard manages to escape under gunfire and disappear into a parade on the street. Richard tracks down another suspect on his list named Frederick Sykes. He sees cops staking out the apartment, so he heads to the roof and breaks into the apartment. He heads inside, where he is shocked to find out that Frederick is his attacker and an ex-cop. He also finds the prosthetic arm and a photo of Frederick and the heads of a pharmaceutical company who are releasing a drug called Provasic. Richard had investigated the drug and discovered adverse side effects that would have stopped it from getting FDA approval. Richard contacts Samuel directly from Frederick's apartment and stays on the line long enough for them to track his location. Richard then escapes from the apartment just as the cops arrive. The cops sweep the entire apartment and locate the photograph of Frederick and the company. Frederick soon returns to his apartment, and Samuel begins to question him. Samuel learns that he now works security for the pharmaceutical company and denies knowing anything about Richard or his wife. As they leave, Samuel suspects that Frederick is dirty and wants to know everything about the people in the photograph with him. Richard heads over to his old workplace to gather samples of patients using Provasic and brings them to a friend, where he realizes that his samples were all changed by Charles, who is also a board member at the pharmaceutical company. Meanwhile, Frederick gets a call, and minutes later fire trucks pull up, distracting the cops posted, and Frederick grabs his gun and escapes from the apartment. He heads over to the hospital looking for Richard but sees no sign of him and reports back to his employer. Just then, Frederick spots Richard walking along the street and decides to follow him. Richard is sitting on a train when a passenger recognizes him and goes to talk to the cops. Just then, Frederick steps up to face Richard. He pulls his gun and demands that Richard head to the door of the train. The cop tries arresting Richard and gets shot by Frederick. Richard then struggles with Frederick and manages to disarm and knock him down. He then cuffs Frederick and leaves him there. Samuel gets reports of the officer shooting and worries that Richard has gone too far. They then get reports that Richard has been spotted at a hotel nearby, the same hotel where Charles is to give a keynote speech at a conference. The cops arrive at the hotel and lock the entire building down as they try to track Richard down. Richard has arrived at the conference room and watches as Charles talks about Provasic and how it has no side effects. Charles spots Richard in the crowd and becomes increasingly uneasy. Richard confronts him publicly for being the mastermind behind his wife's death. As Charles tries to walk away, Richard publicly reveals how Charles covered up Provasic reports. Richard goes looking for Charles, who attacks him. The two begin to fight, ending up out on the balcony. Richard gets the upper hand, demanding an explanation as to why his wife had to die. A Chicago PD chopper arrives at the rooftop, demanding the men surrender, but Charles takes off running. The cops open fire on Richard, forcing him to take cover. Richard goes after Charles once more. This time, the fight causes them to fall through a sunroof onto a lift. Charles first awakens and escapes the elevator onto the laundry floor. Richard soon also awakens and goes looking for Charles. Samuel also arrives at the laundry room, gun in hand, and begins looking for the two men. Samuel calls out to Richard, telling him to surrender as there is nowhere to go and that he knows that Charles was behind the entire thing. He had borrowed Richard's car the night of the murder and gave his keys to Frederick to break in. Meanwhile, Charles manages to knock out Samuel's second and take his gun. Charles pounces on Samuel to shoot him, but Richard attacks him in time, saving Samuel's life. Richard then surrenders to Samuel, who is glad that everything is over. Charles and Frederick are arrested, and Richard is escorted from the hotel with the press questioning the police. Samuel uncuffs Richard in the back of the car, reassured that he will be exonerated.